Cussen. Welcome to the Earthly Delights podcast. Thanks for making time. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very well. It's been lovely already to meet you guys, and I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, us too. Us too. Did you get snow down in Limerick?
We did not
No.
in the last week. There was some sleet. Was it yesterday? There was
On
sleet here. I
Friday there
hear
was
you got a
loads of
bit of a
snow up here.
battering up the country, did you?
Yeah, it was like it was like 3 inches of snow. It was madness, and then it just went
Yeah.
away.
Yeah. Can I just, as a meta commentary, like straight out the gate, can I just say how much I love starting a podcast with an Irish person, and the first question is about the weather. It's the most. How do we put an Irish guest at rest here? Ask him about the weather. He's going to be relaxed straight out the gate. He's going to feel like he's right at home.
How does
But
he
it
know
isn't
that I
snow,
mean
so
well?
it, but it's unusual weather. But I guess it's
Yes,
all, we live in unusual times. So
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
the East Coast always tends to get hit a bit worse, though. We just get more consistent rain, whereas you get the extremes of good and bad weather.
Okay, okay. Thanks for that.
That's the opinion of someone outside the pale.
Uh,
You might not have
we need to
much
get
experience of what it's like out here, but that's the.
we get the tokenistic opinion outside of the pale.
It's good stuff.
The first question we ask all our guests is for you to tell us a bit about yourselves. And I guess what I mean by that is kind of how did you first come across philosophy? How did you decide that you wanted to pursue it? And then how did you end up making this like really impressive body of work on YouTube and through podcasts?
Impressive body. Where I haven't heard it described as that before. I appreciate that. So philosophy I actually came across as a teenager. I was I had a lot of social anxiety as a teenager. I was very isolated, and I kind of just buried my head in the sand. Like, I was very smart as a kid, and then as a teenager I discovered I wasn't that smart, and so that kind of like that life raft that I could grab onto was gone, and so I was just adrift in adolescence, and didn't really know what was going on. I played a lot of video games, and then I was around 16, and it just spiraled into like, oh, I'm actually in a place where I'm kind of locked in. I feel the image that I always had in my mind is, have you seen Lord of the Rings? Do you know the Fellowship of the Ring? So do you know when they're in Moria and they're going down those staircases? And there's like these staircases with a massive gap in the middle of them. And I felt like I was on a plateau, and if I could hop to the other side, then it was like the pathway could go onwards and upwards, and I could see how my life could work. I could see how things could get better. But I just felt like there was an uncrossable chasm between me and taking any action to make things better.
Wow.
And I just felt imprisoned in that. And so that just kind of got darker and darker over that summer when I was 16. And then I just had like this emotional sort of explosion. My mother was like, "Go get a job," and I was like, "I fucking can't. I can't fucking leave the house." And just at some point, I just blew the lid with her, and I think there was something in that, like, there's in a release of emotion, no matter how cringy. Quite often, it allows things in the psyche to move,
Mm-hmm.
and from there, I was just like, well, there's nothing I can do, but should probably tone down the video games. And I just started reading again.
Okay.
And I just read things like, just had these little old classics around the house. So an abridged version of The Three Musketeers and Jack London's Call of the Wild, and Arthur Conan Doyle had this book, The Lost World. There were hero stories. The hero starts off as some kind of, as with any hero's journey, this kind of pathetic, cringy, simp kind of waste of a thing. And then in the course of the story goes through all these challenges, and becomes something alive and something quite formed. And I think, and I've been writing about this recently, I think there's something in that just that that reanimates us, that awakens those archetypes of heroism in us. But I just found that was starting to give me more energy. And then there was one book, I was kind of going through this phase of reading novels, and then my brother and my dad were like, "Oh, there's this great book that we both read. It's called The Outsider by Albert Camus." And I was like, oh, interesting. So I read it and I was like, this is unlike anything I've read. Like, what the hell is this? And I got to the end of it and I was like, this is completely unusual. I got to read more of this guy. And my dad, luckily, had the exact same impression. Had gone off, bought a load of Albert Camus books, and had read about 3 pages of one of them and was like, oh yeah, this isn't for me. Discovered the philosophy wasn't to his taste, even if existential literature might have been. So I read the first page of Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, and the first line is, the only true philosophical problem is suicide. And I was like, I'm home. I didn't understand 95% of the rest of that book, but when I read that line, and he's talking about Nietzsche, he's talking about Zarathustra, he's talking about Dostoevsky, the myth of Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill and life being this repetitive, just grind that has no meaning. Just those things just landed so heavily, and I was like, this is what I am. This is what I've been searching for. These are my people, and just an immediate, like, strong sense. And I had a piece of paper, and I was writing down the names he was mentioning, like Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Zarathustra, and I went down this rabbit hole on Wikipedia, and by the end of that, just my dad bought me a load of these books, and through Camus I discovered Nietzsche, and from Nietzsche it was game over, and from there I just knew I wanted to be a philosopher. And yeah, just the dreams of being, because with Nietzsche as well, it's like he's speaking into your ear. He's kind of like, oh, this isn't for everyone. This is just for my chosen free spirits, the philosophers of the future. And so there was that sense of, whatever about the hero stories, waking up the archetype in you. This is like real world, and Nietzsche is just like, no, you are trusted with the secret. This is so there was something incredibly empowering, and I felt like I'm onto something here. And yeah, from there I was just like, okay, I know I want to study philosophy. I want to write philosophy. This is the way. And went off to study philosophy then in Aberdeen. Got more into psychology, spirituality, and did kind of a lot of self-experimentation and just trying out a lot of different things to just, I guess, I was taken with Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's kind of tied into the ancients, and so is Camus, and this idea of philosophy being very connected to the good life and what it is to live well. So ended up down that rabbit hole and haven't really come out of it, even though I kind of went through a more of a psychological phase, but have come back to philosophy since. Like, YouTube has really brought me back to it. I didn't think I was going to be able to study philosophy till I was in my 50s. I remember saying that to my dad and my brother at some point, and they were like, what? You're waiting 30 years to really go study this? And I was like, yeah, it's just, Plato said a thing. So yeah, it was just it's just been a wonderful meandering journey, but philosophy it's just part of who I am at this point. It's shaped me so much, and yeah, it's my own philosophy has been shaped in response. And so the channel is called The Living Philosophy, and personally I've understood that in 2 ways. So it's about philosophy that you live, so it's about a living philosophy, but I also feel like there's something in the philosophy itself that's living, that there's something that's emerging, there's something that philosophy is never finished. It's not a thing out there to be discovered. It's something that's living and born. And I can imagine if we imagine parallel universes, there would be different schools of philosophy, completely different ways of looking at the world. And we can look to other cultures to see that already. But I feel like philosophy itself is something living and emerging with us. And so, yeah, there's kind of this synchronistic, synergistic kind of connection with it.
Thanks for that, James. And did you notice, say, that kind of moment when you were 16 and your mom's like, go get a job? Did you notice then, once you finally found the books and finally found Camus, that maybe heaviness, that kind of anxiety about the world, was that kind of slowly decreasing as a result of you kind of finding this passion, this kind of words for things that you were feeling but probably couldn't express?
Yeah, I think the sense of purpose, the sense of being part of something that's stretched through history, something much greater than myself, and that what I was experiencing, and Brene Brown talks about this a lot, that shame requires us to feel isolated. If you connect with people, you find out that, oh, actually, this thing that I thought was just me, and that's why it was so horrifying, actually, there's a lot of other people going through it. And I've seen this with, there's a girl I used to go out with, and she was going through a really dark time and was really struggling with suicidal ideation, and she read Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. which you would think would be the worst thing for someone in that situation to read, but it was actually connected because someone got it, and so there's this strange thing of just connection. And so I think that's what I got from Camus and philosophy, was a sense of not just connected to a greater tradition, but also just connected to, oh, I'm not alone, and my experience is part of a universal human experience. It's not the isolated James's shame and imprisonment. It's part of this human condition that we're trying to figure out the best way to live it. So yeah, and not like overnight I was completely better, but definitely having that sense of something, that sense of solid ground, it just changed the way I interacted with the world. And especially then when I went to Scotland, I became insufferable because I wouldn't stop talking to people about philosophical subjects and, trying to start arguments with people so I could do some Socratic shit with them. But that's what happens. You get inflated with this thing you've discovered, and then you try and bring that to the world, and then you mature into it. You grow into it yourself, where before you were just wearing someone else's kind of jacket, I guess.
I love that answer. Particularly the kind of ego trip of now I'm going to annoy people with this. Part and parcel, isn't it? Like,
it's so cringe, but yeah, it's part of life. Yeah.
Absolutely, we've all been there.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I was wondering, could you give your definition of philosophy for people who might maybe have their own, or kind of, that's only for people that just stay in their room all day and that kind of thing?
So when I was in Aberdeen, there was a 12-week module we did on a subject called meta-philosophy, which is the question, what is philosophy? So there's a lot of debate, and it's a long-standing debate in philosophy about what the fuck philosophy is. So it's obviously, I just want to put that context in place for when I give my answer. There's no take it with a pinch of salt. I'm not speaking on behalf of philosophers, but I think an important thing to realize is that philosophy, all of science and all of our intellectual tradition, is kind of born out of philosophy. So when Newton wrote the piece in which he kind of gave us the new theory of gravitation, it was principles of natural philosophy. And natural philosophy at that point was still, this is coming out of an Aristotelian distinction, but the natural philosophy was the study of the physical world. And so that's morphed into, once we found the right methodology for it, that kind of got hived out of philosophy and became physics, biology, chemistry, and other hard sciences. And as time has progressed, more and more philosophy has been hived off anything that we could apply the methodologies of science to. So probably the most recent ones are, you could argue that political philosophy it's turned into political science. But yeah, so things like that, sociology, psychology, more the late 19th century. And so I feel like it's very hard to define what philosophy is once you've cut off all these pieces of it, because it was much more of a unified quest for just understanding before. So from the ancient Greek, philosophy is philo, meaning to love. So specifically the love of a friend, but philo to love, and Sophia is wisdom. So it's just the love of wisdom. And so what's left of philosophy is logic, like that you'll find in the philosophy faculty these days: logic, ethics, epistemology, ontology. So epistemology being the study of how do we know what we know, and what counts as knowledge. Ontology being like what is being, what is the nature of reality. Ethics obviously being, well, how do we live our lives, and logic being trying to figure these, like what is the methodology, and what is the rigorous thing. And what you see with philosophy is like what's left is the things that you cannot apply because they're the foundation on which everything else is built, on which our entire intellectual tradition is built. And there's been a good few scientists, Stephen Hawking being probably the most recent, but there's been a few others recently. What's that guy, the insufferable astrophysicist who did Carl Sagan's Cosmos? What's his name? Neil deGrasse Tyson. He said it as well. It's just so annoying. But yeah, so just they say that philosophy is dead. I'm just like, you don't really have a clue what you're talking about. Now with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's kind of saying within the context of he doesn't think philosophers should be telling physicists what the meaning of their stuff is, and that's fair enough. But that doesn't mean it means you can have philosophers within physics that it's all very. The point I guess I was making is that some people think that philosophy is dead, but I think that that's it's absolute nonsense. And you can see over in the field of mathematics, there's a lot of debate as to whether maths is real or not. Is maths a model of the world, or is maths real, independent of humans and the numbers that we have? So it seems like the maths is written into the code of reality, whereas others just think, no, this is just a model we've created and it just works because it's an approximation. And so philosophy kind of cuts to the core of, once you get down to it, like, what the hell is going on here? If you actually get into the deepest, most profound, most vast questions that are almost ungraspable and thus will repel most people because you can't even get a handle. It's the most vast questions. And I've been studying more Heidegger recently, and Heidegger is just trying to get back to the question of what being is. Like, what is it? He's like, we've forgotten what the question of being is for 2,500 years. We've forgotten it since Plato and Aristotle, and so we need to ask the question of being again. And then he spends this incredibly long piece of work in Being and Time talking about what it is to be human, and then he never gets back to the question of what is being, and then it like leaves it to his later works. And so it's just these challenges that are almost potentially impenetrable because we're within this thing. And so how do we know what the nature of reality is? We don't. How do we know what is knowledge? Well, it all seems so slippery when you try and apply a definition that is going to last. And so philosophy is just this vastness. But I think you could think of it as a spirit of questioning, as a curiosity of what is it, and just a love of learning and knowledge and wisdom. And the wisdom kind of being the other half when we come into ethics about how to live your life and how, like, what is the good life? What are we here for? And kind of coming into those questions of meaning and I guess reflection, the part of philosophy that has become psychology of what is the nature of humanity. And so there's this quest of knowledge and wisdom that is philosophy. It's almost a childlike spirit of searching. And that is a very, very unsatisfactory definition, but that is the best I can give you right now.
I love that. The question that kind of comes to mind straight away is, and I think there's parallels with what you're talking about, where the curiosity that you're talking about, the spirit of why and how do we know these things, and what are we taking for granted, and do we really know this, and what about that? It seems incredibly fruitful because so often we do take things for granted, and then when we don't consider them, we won't appreciate them as much. Even just like a simple thing of how did the food end up on your plate today, that kind of thing, and why do we have these schools of thought? But I wonder, and I want your kind of take on this, is there a point where philosophy is too grounded in the mind? So it reminded me, because you're mentioning 2.5 years ago, we were much more focused on what is being. And I wonder, is what is being more grounded in also what does the body experience, or what does more than the mind experience? And I wonder, do you feel that, like, roughly over the last few thousand years, that we are kind of focusing more and more attention on what can be thought, and are we realizing the limitations of what can be considered? Or
That's a brilliant question. Yeah, and there's something that was coming to mind was there was a schism in Christianity around the 10th century between the Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And Eastern Orthodoxy was obviously still part of a living empire. So the Roman Empire still existed in Byzantium or Constantinople. And so the schism was kind of between the Western tradition, which was held back then to be much more grounded in like an intellectual kind of thing. There was much more of a rigorous intellectual kind of tradition. Maybe we could call that the Athenian kind of version of Christianity. And then whereas Eastern Orthodoxy was much more concerned with a sort of mysticism, was much more concerned with the experience of the the experience of the Christian mystery, I guess. And so you could see that even from that, long before any of the modernity and all of this scientific materialism might have warped us a bit, you could see that this was already a predisposition that we had in the West. And it's interesting with Heidegger. His work, he was writing 1920s up to 1940s, or well, I guess up to 1960s. But his big work was 1928, Being and Time. And there's been a lot of map overs between Heidegger and Far Eastern philosophers. Because Heidegger, again, is trying to get back to the question of being. He's trying to cut through the veil, has a completely different attitude towards truth and life, and is trying to get back to something much more grounded. And Heidegger said that you can't do philosophy outside the Black Forest. Taking that as a not a universal prescription, but if we just say that you got to be in nature, you have to be connected to something, that you have to be grounded in the natural experience. And so Heidegger can be seen as very influential in ecological kind of circles of trying to get back in touch with that something other than the human herd, we'll say, and the intellectual component of that. And so I think with that, you can say that in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and also in the Far East traditions like Zen and the various Chinese Indian traditions, there is much more of an emphasis in those directions. Now, I mean, you get traditions like Nagarjuna in Buddhism that is just as great as any intellectual Western stuff. There's very, very intellectual stuff in Indian thought as well. But yeah, if you look at the likes of like Lao Tzu, Chuang-Tzu, the Taoists and Zen thinkers, it is much more grounded in a pragmatic, which I would consider to be closer to the wisdom pursuit of philosophy, but there is the knowledge pursuit has become the one that is primary in the West. And yeah, is it too intellectual? I mean, it's certainly started that way, and I feel like there's a turn that's happening. Like at a certain point, you kind of crest the wave, and you realize that there's more beyond the intellectual. And so ecology being a great example of a sort of a science that undermines the atomization of science and gets out of the human specificity and gets into the. But again, you can still say that that's still an intellectual detachment from it all. Yeah, it's because it's for me, I don't really make that distinction as much between body and mind, and I don't know why not. I think that yeah. So I tend not to see things in terms of like the Western tradition being too intellectual, even though I can't help but agree. Like I can see the perspective, but yeah, I guess the last few years really more around Heidegger and Ken Wilber and the integral tradition, and seeing how maybe this distinction between the body and mind is somewhat arbitrary, and the body and the brain and the heart as being somewhat of it's a model in itself. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways of cutting it up. There's another great thinker, a neuroscientist, Ian McGilchrist, who talks about the distinction. You're aware, so I don't have to go too much into it, but the left hemisphere being very much living in he believes that the modern world is caught in this runaway loop of left hemisphere preference, where we're too caught in this model of the world, and we're intellectualizing the world and reacting to that model of the world, and it's become a feedback loop, and it's more and more caught in itself, whereas the right hemisphere is about embodiment, it's about relation, it's more about connecting to other things and seeing the bigger picture rather than just being stuck in a model. So he sees the left hemisphere as being representation of the world, so it's representing it. It's never directly experiencing the world, it's always in the past and the present, or the past and the future, whereas the right hemisphere is very much grounded in the current experience. So you could say that is an over-intellectualizing, like the left hemisphere is an over-intellectual relationship with the world, and the right hemisphere is trying to connect more in. So there's a lot more different angles I can approach this from, but I think I'm not sure if any of that is ringing true for you.
No, I appreciate the consideration there.
You can imagine why my writing process is so painful, because I'll sit down with a problem and I'm like, okay, let me just start saying something here, and then I'm like, but you gotta look at it from this thing, and oh, what did this person said this thing, and then so I'm just applying these, like it's like an optometrist with all these different lenses of these different
Oh.
thinkers that I've studied, and I'm like, I don't fucking know what I'm talking about. Like, this thing is a mess. There's too much going on. Like, there's no linear, because I'm trying to, I guess, get outside of my individual model of the world, and then you can there's too much. Once you realize there's a multiplicity ways looking at the world, you can just get lost in the labyrinth, and it's hard to say anything.
It reminded me very much of, so when I was in A level, I did philosophy for about 3 weeks until I actually got kicked out. And the reason for being kicked out wasn't for being like naughty or anything like this, but it was, the first lesson was something along the lines of like, what is purple? Or it was like something, oh, purple's a color, it's this, I can show you, whatever. And it's like, no, but what is that? And I'm like, it's fucking purple, mate, I'm showing you. You have to like, and she's it reminded. I always had the image of is it in Rush Hour where like the guys in Chris Tucker's like talking to the Chinese, what is he, like Marshall Kung Fu, whatever. He's like, who are you? And he's like, I am you. And he's like, no, who are you? And he's like, yes, I am you. And he just kept talking like that, and the teacher just kept me asking me questions, like what is, and this went on for about 2 to 3 weeks. And in the end, she just like, no, you can't do philosophy. Because I just couldn't, like, when she'd ask me a question, I'm like, it's this. And she's like, no, but what is that? And I'm like, yeah, I just fucking answered your question. And watching you there was kind of reminding me of that. Of like, you're giving an answer, but in the same breath, you're questioning your own answer. And then it was just like,
it's about the parameters, right? Like, what is purple? Are we talking about, in the context of painting a wall, in the context of a Dulux color chart? Like, what is the context in which we're talking about purple? Are we talking about electromagnetic radiation? Because I can talk about purple in that sense. It's between this nanometer and this nanometer. But, like, it's I guess you what to do in that situation is get her to be like, okay, tell me what yellow is, and I'll tell you what purple is. Because I need to know what type of answer you're looking for if I'm going to answer the question. And so,
whereas 16-year-old me was just like, I can show you what it is, I'm pointing out what it is, and you're not accepting me, and you just ask me the same question, I'm going insane here.
Which is actually a very wise philosophical thing, because I think it was Wittgenstein, or maybe it was Russell, who said that you can never get beyond this or that with language. It's like, this is the thing. And so it's there's no purer thing of communication than this or that, because it's like, this is the thing. And so this is purple. Can you see this? You might be colorblind if you can't see this is purple. How is this not a good answer for you? It's like a presentation. So
I wonder if, because I mean, you said like you were getting into it just at the same age that I thought that I might be trying to get into it, and realized at that time I was just nowhere near it. With being 16, I wonder if like that that kind of notion of like with philosophy where you just have to question everything and nothing is like a given, nothing is like, oh yeah, that is just what it is, which other disciplines offer you that certainty, right? Wherever it is, science, language, history, it's just like, this is this, Nazism is this, the subjunctive is this, gravity is this. And in philosophy, it's like, just as Jim started off the podcast, what is philosophy? And even and only a philosopher as yourself could give an answer without giving a full answer, right? And it's like, I wonder if like you believe that is, I don't know if barrier is the right word, because maybe it's the right filtration system to not allow everyone to try and study philosophy, but like if that's like stops people from, because so one of the things to get into this is like there's been a lot of cultural gurus that come along and recently and kind of like made millions of dollars out of this. Jordan Peterson's kind of probably the main guy. And one of the critiques of Jordan Peterson, and he has many, but one of them is like, you ask him a question and the first thing he'll do is say, he'll like dissect the question in terms of like, what is the question that you're asking me? So you could be like, when do you believe in Jesus Christ? And he'll be like, well, what is Jesus Christ? And then you're like, for fuck's sake. I mean, it's like, he just asks you, and on some level, from the very little study I have of philosophy, I kind of understand that maybe that's almost like a principle of philosophy, that you have to like get to the you have to ask everything. But then on the other hand, it almost feels like sometimes a bit of a cop out, where it's like we have language and it might have its barriers, it might have its limitations, but we have to understand that if I ask what is Jesus Christ, we all know who we're talking about here. Why are you asking me why am I having to answer my own question about your question about my question? Do you know what I mean? It feels like we get ourselves in the weeds. That he never has to provide a definitive answer one way or the other, and it's like his way of like kind of putting himself on a pedestal, making everyone else feel stupid. Yeah. I wonder how you deal with that critique of philosophy, if you think that's just an essential part, and that as normal people who don't get involved with
it's not normal.
I'm putting you on a platform that I don't put myself on. If we just have to accept that is what philosophy is, and that
if I'm going to be not normal, at least I'm better.
Exactly.
So the thing that was coming to mind there is, have you heard of Thomas Kuhn? Like the idea of a paradigm?
I have not. No.
So a paradigm, it was Kuhn wrote this book back in '62, and it kind of turned over the apple cart and upset everyone because science was no longer this linear thing heading towards absolute truth. Kuhn came up with this idea of the paradigm, which has become a massive buzzword in business. So we need to have a paradigm shift. We need to change our way of thinking. But Kuhn was basically saying how the world that we lived in shifted as scientific eras shifted. So there was this thing in the era of Lavoisier in chemistry in the 18th to 19th century. There was this a thing called phlogiston. And phlogiston turned out to not exist. It was just something that fit in the model that was made. It was kind of like, oh, we think that this is what causes oxygen to behave in this way. And it turned out to be complete nonsense, which only could have happened once they learned more. And so as science develops, there's like things that are lost that were taught to be true. And so the model, science is always just a model. And so there's a lot gained, and we're better at predicting the world as the paradigms evolve. But there's also a loss in the world we live in changes. And so what he says about a paradigm is we'll say Newton came along with the theory of gravitation. And at that point, well, we'll say with the next generation, because Max Planck had this great line that science proceeds one funeral at a time, because people will hold on to the beliefs that the paradigm that they're in. And you can even see that in the 20th century. There's this guy, Fred Hoyle, who was just like, he was the head astronomer in the UK, and he said that the Big Bang Theory was importing a religious concept into science. And I think he died around 2002, and he hadn't sworn off that. He still didn't believe in the Big Bang because he said, no, this is just a religious concept. It's just re-importing it back into science. And so you see that people will hold to a certain paradigm and they'll work within that. And so the generations after Newton took for granted Newton's model of the world. They took for granted his solutions, his way of solving it. And then what that does is it creates a model of the world, and you now know what you're trying to solve, or you know what certain types of problems appear to you within that. So you're fed a way of looking at the world. And by looking through those lenses, only certain problems will emerge, only certain ways of being will emerge. And so it's when you're in a scientific domain, the paradigm is kind of given to you, because basically all sciences now, well, we'll say maybe some of the human sciences probably don't have paradigms necessarily, or there's multiple competing ones. But if you go into chemistry, there's certain ways of talking about problems. In physics, it's the same, even though there's debate as to whether an electron exists. I just saw that during the week, that like there's an argument in among theoretical physicists whether electrons are a model or whether they actually exist. But you have to take it for granted as working within a certain system. And so I think when you're working in science, or when you're working in most domains, if you're working in a certain job, you're fed. There's a lot of things you don't have to think about, because you're like, hey, here's what we think, here's what we're working on, so here's your lane, stick to it.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to philosophy, because of what you're dealing with, you're kind of like, say, the idea of a paradigm itself, that's a philosophy of science kind of thing. So it's outside of science, looking at how science works, and it goes, is this what's going on? And so you're kind of inherently paradigmless, because if anything, if philosophy had a paradigm, it would become a science. You know what I mean? If there was a way of solving the problems of what is being, of what is knowledge, then all of a sudden you'd have a research program and things would work within that. So I think philosophy is inherently, it's inescapably labyrinthine. Like I don't think you can get away from that, and I don't think you can get away from the paralysis of never really having certainty. And I think that fits with the right hemisphere thing as well, is that you have to stay in an openness. And I think for me, it wasn't anything exceptional about me. I think it was just that I was in such a dark time that, and everything, I was treading water, and I had nothing to grab onto, and all of a sudden there was this thing it was a field of thought that was treading water. Its entire thing was treading water. It was like, there is no continent. We do not know what's going on. And so that just really fit with what I was going through. Like, I don't know. Like, I'd never, the Christian thing never really bit with me. I'd been an atheist from a very young age. And so I was already living in this world where it was like, it was already kind of a denuded world for me. And so there was something in philosophy that gave me a quest, or gave me some kind of higher meaning that I'd never had. And so it was just, even though it was just a quest, even though it was just a search and an endless search, there was something in that fit with my temperament. So I don't think it's necessarily about complexity of thinking or anything like that, but I think there's got to be a tolerance for uncertainty, a tolerance for just be completely loosey-goosey with what you understand the world to be, and being okay with not knowing. I think that's kind of the prerequisites, and that's only going to suit certain people. Most people are just going to want, I've worked with harder scientific problems before, and it's so nice. You're like, I understand what's being asked of me. I understand what the answer looks like. It's like, this is beautiful. This is so nice. But I just ended up going into the softest thing ever. It's all over the place,
You said at the very start that like you wanted to become a philosopher. And when you said that, I was like, I don't actually know. I know the names of philosophers, of famous philosophers, but I don't know what constitutes becoming a philosopher. So, in other fields or job titles, I want to become a chef. Well, if you're working in a restaurant and you're cooking, you're then a chef. If I want to become a footballer, well, if you're getting paid to kick a ball around, you're now a footballer. What makes a philosopher? And would you call like these cultural gurus who a lot of people listen to now and try to follow, the Jordan Petersons, the Gabor Mates of this world, would they fall into the definition of being philosophers of our age or not?
I think so. Philosophy or philosopher is one of those terms that I've been hesitant to use it myself out of a degree of imposter syndrome. There's like, it's a word that's got an archetypal charge to it. It's kind of like the shaman or the magician, that there's something, because it's part of this long, lofty, ancient tradition. Unless you're an academic philosopher, it always feels a bit iffy. There's something a little bit like, calling yourself a philosopher. It's kind of like calling yourself a gentleman. It can be a bit cringe. And so, it's a term that's questionable to throw around, but in my opinion, they are philosophers, because I think, especially with Peterson, like they've gone out with the bounds of their domain, and they're trying to solve problems that are much bigger. And even though they're quite inadequate, we can say, I don't know much about Gabor Mate, but with Peterson, you can see, obviously, very esteemed psychologist when it comes to Big Five, and I'm trying to think what else he published scientific papers on. Mostly the Big Five, and he had that understand yourself, so the self-work questionnaire. But outside, like, most of what he talks about is way outside of his lane academically. He's just got academic credentials, but he's talking about woke, he's talking about culture wars. He's just become a sort of a prophetic figure, and in that, I think he's I do think he's a philosopher. It doesn't mean he's a good philosopher. Maybe Plato or Socrates might call him a sophist, which was their kind of opponents back in the day. But I would consider him a philosopher, but it doesn't necessarily mean. But in that, it doesn't mean there's anything of that he's right or that there's much to agree with. But just with the domain that he's stomping around, I think, I would consider him a philosopher.
And just like for Jim come back in here, what do you think? With these philosophers or cultural gurus, however people want to name them, what do you think has led to this need, this want for people like that and a mass following? These people really, like you say, they are in some senses prophetic. John Peterson has mainly, not all, but mainly young men who listen to him, follow him, read all of his books, watch every single podcast. He seems to be, apart from ours, he seems to be on every podcast that you can possibly find. So where do you think that comes from? What's created that vacuum?
With Peterson, I've thought about this a lot. Again, if you give me more names, I can see if I can find a pattern. Gabor Mate is slightly different one, and I don't know enough to really. But with Peterson,
and Ryan Holiday as well, I think he's big.
Ryan Holiday, but is Ryan Holiday? Yeah, like his books are very big and he's very popular, but he's kind of big in the way that Mark Manson is big. You know, he's kind of this a popular writer who gives good advice, but there's something about Peterson that is just taken on a different level of archetypal charge. And I think the reason why Peterson has become a household name isn't because I think if Peterson of Maps of Meaning, by the way, I was a big Peterson fan. I've read Maps of Meaning, love Maps of Meaning, and so much of my worldview in my mid-20s fitted so well with him, Nietzsche, Jung, and I love Maps of Meaning. And I got taken in at the start of the Culture Wars. I was very much on the Peterson and remember seeing him on Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein and these other people of the intellectual dark web, very much being taken in with that. But I think that it's the Peterson of the Maps of Meaning. I don't think if it hadn't been for because I divide them into two. There's the culture warrior Peterson and there's the psychologist Peterson. I don't think if you take away the culture warrior thing, I don't know how big the Maps of Meaning Peterson would have gotten. I don't know how big the psychologist would have been. I certainly wouldn't have been a household name. I think it's the culture wars thing. It's the electrification of the culture since 2011. Yeah, I would say since 2011, since the end of Occupy Wall Street, the rise of social media, you could see this complete explosion on the internet, and 4chan and Tumblr kind of being the two originations of these two subcultures that have emerged as the two sides of this particular culture war. And then Peterson just rode that wave of thunder and just came out. And the thing about Peterson is that as a rhetorician, he's so certain. He speaks with such conviction, and there's just a level of, he doesn't have you saw me getting lost there and been like, I think this, I think that, I don't know. Like I'm trying to see it from all these different perspectives. Peterson is incredibly intelligent and has read a lot of stuff, or has read a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff, and is just able to simplify it into a certain thing and just be like, here is the truth, here it is, and there's no doubt, there's no certainty. You come away from it feeling like you know what's going on, which is, for me, that's kind of antithetical to the spirit of philosophy. Like, if you go back to Plato, every dialogue ended with aporia, aporia being this state of confusion, this state of actually, I don't know what virtue is, I don't know what honor is. You're left with more questions, but also more wisdom in that. Whereas Peterson leaves you with a dangerous type of certainty, and I think that's what's appealing. He's a lightning rod that this energy of the culture wars has galvanized around, and he fits into the figure of I guess a sort of a wise old man, as a sort of an old avuncular patriarchal kind of figure that this type of movement can gather around. And I would look at much deeper roots of why Peterson is successful. I don't know if you're aware of Robert Bly and the men's movement of the 1990s, of noticing the lack of a father. I guess the men were missing something in the transformation of culture, and there was this real death in men. And I read that book, and it's kind of a Jungian take on an old Brothers Grimm fairy tale, and it's incredible. And it started this whole movement in the 90s of men going up into the forest, and it's still going today. There's ones in Ireland, and it's just initiating men into manhood, and it's men in men's spaces trying to deal with what it is to be a man. And I think Peterson is kind of the merging of those trends. He's kind of the father figure that gives young men a sense of here what it is to be a man. You can still be connected to these traditional Enlightenment values and the traditional values before those Enlightenment values, and he kind of gives that sense of meaning, that sense of certainty in a world of, despite Peterson being an avid postmodernist in his rhetoric, but is a modernist in terms of what he actually talks about, or the values he's communicating. He gives you a sense of certainty in an age of total uncertainty. And that's, I think, what's appealing to him, is that so many of us can feel lost and feel like there is no answer and feel like we're put upon, and then here's this thing of certainty that validates us to a certain extent. And I think that's how Peterson has surged so mightily. With Ryan Holiday, I think it's a similar thing. Stoicism being a form of philosophy where it's just like, here's how you live your life. Kind of ascetic, manly, going back to the Romans. It's very, again, it gives you a sense of certainty. It gives you something to work with. It gives you a paradigm within which you can live your life and by which you can judge it. And it doesn't require you to be successful. You can accept the world that it's recovering from the wreckage of neoliberalism. That you can kind of like, in that, you can kind of be like, oh, I'm going to work on myself and here's what I can control and here's what I can't control. And that was also very appealing to me for a time, but you come to a point where you realize, hey, maybe it's not fucking me, maybe the world is fucked and we need to do something about that, and that's a totally different thing. But if you're going to accept the paradigm of self-control and working on yourself, again, Stoicism is appealing. I think Gabor Mate probably has there's the ADHD thing. There's an epidemic of ADHD, and I think that's appealing. There's an epidemic of like trauma. So people identifying with trauma, people identifying with ADHD, not to say that any of that isn't real, but I think that the surge in identification of those and identifying with those labels has led to a massive upsurge in his popularity as well. And again, don't know enough about Gabor Mate to speak at any real length, but that's kind of different things. But I think, that would be why I think Peterson is so electric on a different level. But the others,
And then just forgive me for my ignorance here, and correct me if I am wrong. But I was just wondering, lastly on this, if philosophy, it seems to me anyway from the outside point of view, that is very a male-dominated discipline. Pretty much all the names that people, even if they don't know much about philosophy, the names that they could reel off are all men. The three examples we've just spoken about now, Gabor Mate, Ryan Holiday, and John Peterson, all men, predominantly have male followings. It seems to be a male issue of this sense of like uncertainty, understand, like finding answers, finding solutions. Stoicism is it seems to me, very machismo type strand of thinking. Do you believe that maybe that philosophy? What is it that, if I'm wrong, please correct me, but why is it that it feels like philosophy is very male dominated? Why does it feel like there might be a lack of female input there? And do you think if there is a lack of female input, if that's what you think, do you think that philosophy could benefit from that, from more female input?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think historically, again, because it's an old historical tradition, we can only really see women emerge in any field as anything but an exception from the 20th century onwards. And so there are some very, very notable female philosophers from the 20th century. Now, there are obviously precedents in philosophy before that. Mary Wollstonecraft being like one of the early feminists, but really from the 20th century onwards, what you see is much more women appearing in philosophy, but those names that I all listed kind of skew right, we'll say right of centre, if not, it depends on how far right. But when you look left of, or even if you look in academia, you have people like Martha Nussbaum, who's like one of the biggest philosophers, most well-known philosophers today in academic philosophy, who's virtue ethicist, and she's an amazing thinker. But you go back in the 20th century, you've got the likes of Simone de Beauvoir, who would be one of the biggest names. There's Simone Weil, who wouldn't have been as big, probably because she was just so far out there. But from that same philosophical tradition, you have Hannah Arendt, who is one of the most prominent political theorists. And then if you come up to the current ecosystem, if you look towards the left, you get people like ContraPoints is massive. And ContraPoints is much more of a philosopher than Peterson. But I suppose, where does transgender fit in this spectrum of man-woman is an interesting question as well. In which case, philosophy too will also be questionable. So, yeah, I think. But that being said, so that's that kind of answer is saying, okay, that's a historical answer, saying, yeah, it's beginning to emerge. But I do also think that there's something in. Yeah, I do think there's something about philosophy as a field that is off-putting to women, and I would look at something. Yeah, like I'm going to say something, but I actually don't know. I haven't researched this, so I don't know how true this is. But remember the James Damore document that came out of Google? There was some talk around that. So James Damore got fired from Google because he said that it was that women and men are actually different. That while we have overlapping things, men tend to gather more or women distribution of intelligence and interest in women is much more like around a normal distribution, around a bell curve, whereas men have more at either end. So you get much lower IQ and much higher IQ people among men because they're expendable, because probably neither end of those are going to mate. So you get the men in the middle can still do the mating, and there's still going to be enough to replenish future numbers. But men at the end, very high IQ and very low IQ, probably not going to mate, but some of them are good as cannon fodder and some of them are good as philosophers or scientists. So some of them get the Nobel Prize and some of them win the war. And they're kind of expendable as far as reproduction goes. So there was so the part that I'm not actually sure about was, I remember, and this was kind of around the culture wars kind of period, but talking about how in Sweden have basically removed the barriers to entry for, so basically, I forget exactly how, but basically women were encouraged to study whatever they wanted. And so if you compare what women in North African countries were studying versus women in Scandinavia, what you found is that women in North Africa were much more likely to study STEM subjects, whereas women in Scandinavia were more likely to study softer subjects, more human-oriented subjects, teaching, nursing, these kind of things. And again, I don't know. I haven't studied this, so I'm kind of going out on the limb a bit here. But I would say philosophy kind of fits in with those STEM subjects. Of it's an analytical way of looking at the world rather than a caring way of looking at the world. So you're kind of getting into that very removed, very very abstracted, disconnected from everyday life because you're trying to understand everything. And so if that thing is correct, then what's going on in North Africa is that you're seeing that women are living in very very tough conditions, and so getting a STEM degree is a ticket to a better life. Whereas in Scandinavia, you can kind of say, okay, there's a level of, okay, life is going to be good, this is going to be all right, and so I can choose what I want to study rather than what I need to study out of survival. And so are women selecting out of STEM subjects because there's a gender preference against it? Alternative explanation is that there's a patriarchal thing built into these subjects, and there's an arrogance there, and so maybe there's a culture of masculine arrogance in STEM, and so that could be an alternative explanation. But I think philosophy would fit in with the STEM thing in general, and so you would see the same dynamics as in those subjects, because I think it fits the kind of harder, abstract, more intellectual, disconnected kind of element. And so I don't think it's exceptional, but I imagine it's similar to those other subjects.
Thank you, James, for that. Really appreciate that.
It was another meandering answer, and I apologize again. You could see me trying to try on different things, but yeah, this is
it's great.
It's
It's exactly what we need. It's what we need. We need less certainty, more uncertainty.
Well, come to the right place.
Yeah, I think a while ago I was just saying I'm sweating for the day that the mainstream, that there's this figure, and the figure, whoever they are, is saying actually the issue that we're talking about, it's multifaceted and it depends on the context. Mm-hmm. And I just think, I wonder, as a population, are we actually willing to collectively hold that? You know what I mean? Because like you're saying, I think that Jordan Peterson and these figures that are like trying to make things out like they're black and white and it's clear are kind of just saying something that's fundamentally untrue, and people are a little uncomfortable with it. But still, if they're uncomfortable with it, they'd rather have the blind certainty than sit with the discomfort. And I wonder, well, one question I wanted to ask is about Stoicism and that sitting with discomfort. Because not too long ago, I would have like linked in with Ryan Holiday's work. But I'm going to say about 18 months ago, kind of in coalition with like my relationship and like moving in with my girlfriend, that I almost felt that coincidental, maybe not.
A feminine impact on my life. Suddenly the machismo of like this ancient Roman kind of
doesn't have the same thing to it, no. But I also feel that, particularly, I'm a big fan of Gabor Mate, but the issue that I think when I hear Stoics talk now, is I just think, oh, okay, you're afraid of feeling. You're
Mm.
normalizing not feeling. And I think why I'm drawn to people like Gabor Mate, he says we need to feel. The feelings are important in terms of us knowing ourselves and then thus communicating with people and knowing. And I think
Mm.
I wanted to ask you, I guess it's a little related to my question earlier about, like, are the Stoics using their mind to avoid feeling?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the Neo-Stoicism, there's a large degree of that. I think it's so Neo-Stoicism being like the Ryan Holiday kind of version, the pop Stoicism that exists today, is very, very different to ancient Greek Stoicism and largely to ancient Roman Stoicism. Now, it's much closer to ancient Roman Stoicism, so people like Seneca, who is an utter shill and hypocrite, but a very good writer, very interesting. I don't think that Stoicism, if you go back to it, is really about avoiding feeling. I think it's about living in a hard world, and so there is a degree to which you just have to let go of things. Like Nietzsche had this great line that for those who are living in hard times, for those who fate is rough with, they're best off being a Stoic. But for those who fate gives a little more leeway with, they're better off being Epicureans. So, and he identified more along the Epicurean path. So kind of Epicurus and the Stoics were the two philosophies in ancient times that were kind of like two pseudo religions where people were either Stoics or Epicureans. There were massive movements, and Epicurus being more about, hey, just limit your pleasures and you limit your pains, and that's the good life. Spend time with your friends, spend time just like living life, enjoy the simple things, and that's what it's all about. The Stoic is more, if you're in the middle of hell, well, what can you do? You just kind of you keep an eye on your feelings. You can control what you can control, and I don't think this is much of a like a. I do get the impression in modern Stoicism that there's more of like a suppression of feeling, or there's an antipathy to feeling, and I think it's used among the demographic that are attracted to it as a way of suppressing feeling. It's a way of like avoiding contact with that underworld. But I think in the ancient world, yeah, I think there's like a mid. You know the midwit meme, like so the midwit meme is kind of like people at the lower end of the normal distribution and people at the higher end of the normal distribution can think the same thing, but the people in the middle think the opposite. And so you get the like really stupid average Stoic, but then there's also like very intelligent, like ancient philosophical Stoics that's much more alive and much more like even the original like ancient Greek Stoics. They were the pioneers of free love. There's a lot of this weird shit that you just don't associate with Stoicism, but they were all about abolish all that those traditional things and let's just let's make love, which is just so it doesn't fit in the image, and that's something was lost I think between ancient Greece and ancient Rome when it comes to Stoicism. But yeah, I think there's very big differences, and virtue is completely ignored in the modern thing, and what that means. Anyway, virtue has a whole other meaning in ancient philosophy that would take us far off track. But yeah, I think the way it's used now, I don't think this is necessarily to do with Stoicism, because even you can see CBT evolved out of Stoicism, out of REBT, and then so that way of interacting with and becoming very emotionally intelligent is there in Stoicism, and that's given birth to that movement, that very powerful psychological movement, the cognitive revolution. But on the other hand, yeah, this popular rebirth of it is kind of. Yeah, I feel like it's just a way of bypassing emotions, and it's dangerous in that sense, or is a trap in that sense. Not that I think that Ryan Holiday is trying to trap people. I think his writings are good for a certain level, but it's just once you get to a certain place, you're like, this is being misused, and I don't know. Are you aware of how it's being? It's not facilitating growth for people, or maybe it's helping those people at a certain level. Maybe they just need to get through that level, and then beyond that. They can move on to Epicureanism, but when they're in the pits of hell, maybe they need that version of Stoicism in order to just survive. And so, who am I in my very comfortable Epicurean life to tell people not to go for this form of
Yeah.
Machismo kind of infused. I never used the word machismo, but when you said it, I just it's so nice in the mouth. If you say it, yeah, it's so tasty.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
fairly prevalent over here in Madrid, so it's become part of the vernacular.
yeah. Part of the reality, so it's become part
Yeah.
of the language. I think that's where that culture, it might actually have a role to play.
Mm.
And I haven't looked enough into that Stoic subculture
Okay.
since I was part of it. And part of it is, I was reading those books. I was never active in online communities. So, I would like to go back and study and see what those people are doing, see what's going on in the subreddits and stuff like that, and see to what extent it's emotional avoidance of people who are doing well. And so it's kind of a psychopathic tendency versus just a survival tendency.
Yeah.
Because I think when you're down there, if you need to feed your family, then maybe opening up to a therapist and like unlocking all of your trauma maybe isn't the best way to like get on with things. So I think there's different strokes for different folks.
But if you're, a manager at Ernst & Young and you're struggling to relate to your staff, and you're kind of just saying, this is life, this is work, get on with it, then maybe there might be something else.
I just fired 200 people and I'm getting a massive bonus. How do I quell these feelings of conscience? What do I do? Stoicism. Ancient philosophy from modern life. In that situation, maybe worth having a question.
I wanted to ask you actually, kind of just as you kind of got onto that point there. It seems like a lot of people who either follow Stoicism or whatever, they probably haven't done loads of reading, or not even Stoicism, but if they follow kind of like one strand or one line of philosophy, it feels like normally they kind of they've maybe read one or two books on that certain strand, or they've watched a certain load of TikTok videos or whatever it may be, right? And they haven't kind of done the in-depth study that you have. And so I'm sure there's like learnings that you would say are that we should adapt to our lives according to the circumstances of our lives from different strands. So, right, you're in this moment of your life at this particular time. Hey, listen, adapting a Stoic mindset isn't the worst thing that you could do right now. That'd be pretty good. However, once you get out of this period of your life that you're in, having used the Stoic mindset, now maybe don't use that on your 3-year-old kid anymore, because now we can use this different kind of line of philosophy, right? However. But that ultimately, it requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of study, a lot of time to understand all of these different disciplines, and when to have them all have all these strings to your bow, but understand when to use them and when not to, right? And ultimately, it's kind of a lot easier just to follow one line of thinking. Okay, I'm going to be a Stoic. This resonates with me now, and actually, I'm just going to use it for the rest of my life. So, hey, listen, when my 3-year-old falls over and cries because he grazed his knee, I'm just going to tell him some line from Julius Caesar or whatever, and hey, that's good enough. And it's like, I wonder if you, as someone who kind of does have that more overall view and in-depth view of different disciplines within the overarching discipline of philosophy, if you see the dangers of this kind of like almost of the amateurs, I'd class myself in that where it's like, I'm just going to hang on to this one thing, and that now I'm just going to follow that for as long as it takes me, rather than kind of being like, hey, maybe I need to broaden my mindset here. And it's like, this is good for this, but maybe it's not so good for this situation. Maybe I need to now do some more reading, and I need to kind of leave Stoicism, or whatever it is, whatever you first come across that you find useful. You said that in your early 20s, you had you read certain people, and now maybe you're reading other people. It's like, maybe we should do that a bit more and kind of be a bit more multidisciplined as opposed to like just finding this one path and being like, right, this is me now for the rest of my life.
Yeah. The trouble is, who's got time for that? You know what I mean? And it's these thinkers are not easy to understand, and it's very hard to change that fundamental way of looking at the world. I mean, it's a really, really good question of like, is there, I think we're missing a wisdom tradition. I think we don't have a feedback loop for updating our way of interacting with the world. And so usually what happens is we just have to run into the wall with it. So I think the midlife crisis is a common example of, you have the success myth, the kind of Icarus thing of like, aspire, be great. And then at a certain point you find that doesn't serve you, because you become aware that you're going to die. And so you start to question what the point of life is. And that changes so running into those those speed bumps is they kind of work in a world that doesn't have a wisdom tradition. But ideally, we'd have a wisdom tradition where we could have, I don't know, some way of knowing about these things, or some way of knowing that there's other ways of looking at it. It's just such a hard thing to know, because all of my stuff has just happened by happenstance. You know what I mean? I just feel like
I wonder if, like, within the actual teachings themselves, I haven't done the reading, so this is a genuine question. Do they, like, when you read the original, writings of Stoicism or whatever it may be, do they kind of tell you, hey, listen, like, in very layman terms here, but like, this teaching or this thing that I'm talking about here is really good for this, like, this specific circumstance or whatever. Do they kind of recognize their own limitations, or within each teaching, within each discipline, do they adopt this, like, this sense of, this is the way? If you're reading me, then you should be following this throughout your whole life, regardless of the circumstance? Or do they actually kind of acknowledge and say, listen, if you're reading Stoicism, whatever, this is great for such and such, but maybe if you're looking for lessons with outside of this scope or outside of this arena, perhaps Stoicism isn't right for this circumstance. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's a good question.
You're not going to get that in ancient traditions. There was very much a vine. But now, the house that you were living in with those traditions should have been big enough that there should have been room to move around. Again, in the Platonic, if you're a part of the Platonic school, then a core part of the dialogues of the pieces, the cornerstone pieces of work in that, were ending in uncertainty. We're ending in, I'm not sure. And that evolved into the school of skepticism, which was kind of like, well, we don't really know, so let's listen to different things. But really, yeah, I mean, I just don't think you get that there. I think, I can't think of anyone until Nietzsche who has that kind of perspective. Hegel tries to systematize them all. The scholastics of the Middle Ages were just trying to reconcile philosophy and Christianity. Descartes and the early modern philosophers were more about most philosophers just trying to solve a certain problem. And so the question of perspectives and seeing different philosophies as different gears probably isn't coming in until the age of postmodernism, when the unified vision fragments. And because we'll say with the modern philosophers, the Enlightenment era, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, these guys were all birthing this, the sacred tablet of values that Peterson is trying to protect so much, this universal truth, the liberty, equality, fraternity, or liberty, equality, or liberty, what's the one in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or life, liberty, and property in John Locke's formulation. They've got these universal rights that everyone should have access to, and so there's a very universal tradition. And again, that seems like a very big home, but I think that there's times to be questioning the values of Enlightenment era stuff, because I think we're running into the problems of that in the postmodern era. So yeah, I think until you get to postmodern thinkers, of which I would include Nietzsche, you don't really get that nuance, that level of like, hey, maybe this is good for that, or that's good for the other thing. You don't really get that sense of things, I don't think. Now, you get it in wisdom traditions. They say in Islam that the Quran was written on 7 different levels. And so depending on where you're at, you will get something different when you're reading the book. And I think there's something lost in not having that deep relationship with a deep book. And we don't have a canonical work anymore. And so we don't have something that you keep going back to, getting something different out of. Like, I read The Lord of the Rings every few years, and I have since I was 12, and I get something different out of it. It'll spark something in me, but it's not, and that was kind of Tolkien's intention, was to write a new kind of mythology for people. But there's something in the Bible, like as flawed as these books were, you go back and there's something new that jumps out at you. These books were written as wisdom for an entire people. And so you go back and there's levels of wisdom where you'll see things a slightly different way. And I remember talking to a Christian on Camino, and he was saying, I'll judge how good church is by how they read the prodigal son. And he's talked about these 4 or 5 different levels of reading the prodigal son, and I was like, that's really fucking interesting. And I just don't think we have a kind of a canonical work. We're actually just drowning in information that we're worn thin, and so we don't have time to think about different ways to look at life, because we're just trying to keep up with fucking surviving. And that's the thing. And I'm reading a lot of Marx at the moment. I'm actually seeing a lot of value in Marx in terms of, he just believed, okay, we've got enough work to live. Like, what about human development, though? What about actually, the potentials for us becoming what the germ that is within us, like sprouting. And I just really identify with that, where I feel like more than ever we're just drowning in information and we're not getting anywhere. We're struggling more and more, I think, on a mental level, because we're not made for this level of infinity. And I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how to relate with that, because I, just as much as anyone, I'm drowning in it, and I'm just trying to understand the people from the past, never mind the philosophers of the present. So I'm just like, I'm trying to keep an eye on what's going on, but I'm also just being like, what the fuck was Hegel talking about again? So I'm just trying to. There's so much of this tradition that I'm trying to figure out, and I just feel like it's still. I feel like I'm drowning, and I'm someone who's got all the time in the world to be reading and studying these things, and so I'm just like, what do we do? Where do we go from here? Because I don't. We're just not made. We don't have the bandwidth for this, and we don't have the time to be wise. And the thing with Heidegger, I think, if we all had 6 months to chill out in the Black Forest, we'd probably change the way we look at the world, and we wouldn't need to look to Stoicism or Epicureanism. We wouldn't need to look to ready-made solutions. We'd go, do you know what? That's not working for me. I've realized after 3 weeks of walking in the forest, maybe that's not different. Maybe when I go back home, I'll do this differently. I'll do that differently. But we don't have time to have that peace to allow the right hemisphere to allow the new patterns to emerge. We're just stuck in a survival mode, trying to hold on to the model of the world that we've got and just survive within that. And I think the idea of reading Darwin as being all about competition and just about survival of the fittest in terms of out competing others, rather than alternative Darwinian interpretation of seeing it as a cooperative thing. We're just taken in by this idea of competition, and neoliberalism's just really doubled down on that. And so we just find that we're just struggling to survive. Yeah. So there's a housing crisis, a mental health crisis, and we don't know where the fuck to start. And so I think we're all just trying to figure it out. And it's, again, I've just gone off into the vast.
Well, you've gone off there onto a beautiful tangent, because it just leads to like my final line of questioning before Jim kind of wraps up with his is. You talk about how like we've maybe don't have time for reflection or enough reflection anyway, and contemplation, and now we're kind of, it feels worldwide that we're kind of dealing with the housing crisis. We're dealing with all different manners of crisis at the moment, right? And unfortunately, whether it's clever or evil or whatever it may be, it seems like what a lot of the governments do to kind of deflect blame from themselves about these crises that they have created, or they've not created, not stopped anyway, or not found solutions to, is to find like an enemy, someone to point at for us to all to blame, right? And just to like give like a little anecdote, and then I'd love to like to hear your kind of a viewpoint on this. When I was visiting Jim not too long ago now, I can't remember the exact dates. My dates are terrible. But we were in Dublin, and we were in a pub, and we were just talking to one of the women in the pub, and somehow got onto immigration. Actually, no, we got onto immigration because Jim had travelled a lot. Yeah, like he's been to Maastricht. He's travelled a lot through studies and also just living experience. He's quite a well-travelled guy, and we were talking about that with the woman, and then from there it got very quickly onto the immigration topic, which obviously we all know is quite a touchy topic at the moment. I kept out of it because I feel like I had the wisdom enough to understand that my English accent wouldn't do anything to calm this lady down in a
you've learned that is wisdom
in a Dublin pub. So I just kept stum, which was not as easy as I thought it would be, because she was spouting some quite vile stuff, and Jim did his very best to kind of try and show her the errors of her thinking without being offensive or without kind of, do you know what I mean? And I think he did very well there. But what it basically came down to was like, all these Muslims, they move into our country, they rip up the passports and they get all these benefits, and then it's like, and then she said that she was in favor of the Ukrainians and they should be fighting their own war, and she's like very proud of them. But then on like 2 minutes later down the argument, she was saying how, well, what about these Ukrainians who are coming to the island? Why shouldn't they be fighting their own war? I was like, well, a minute ago you were saying that you're proud of them. Now you're saying, and then also there's also a part of this thing which was very surreal for me, which was like, obviously me being half Italian, we have a huge diaspora throughout the world. the Irish are known for having a massive diaspora and immigrating throughout the world to look for better opportunities. And it's maybe stupid on my part to kind of assume that Irish people in general would take that on and understand that, hey, listen, we've immigrated all over the world in search for better times. Why would I now kind of chastise anyone else for doing that, especially when they come from such desperate times and countries themselves? But that never seemed to dawn on this woman. But what was even more shocking still was that actually this conversation wasn't that shocking in and of itself. It wasn't like, you couldn't just say, oh, she's a crazy old lady, let's forget about her. It just felt like, oh no, if we actually sat down and spoke to many people, this is what loads of people are thinking. And it's just a lot of people kind of in public atmospheres, public spaces, they don't really maybe have the bottle to say what they're really thinking. But this is the stuff that's going on in living rooms all over the world, not just Ireland, all over the world. I live in Madrid, I am an immigrant, and people have told me about how immigration is terrible. Then when I bring up that I'm the immigrant that they're telling this to, they go, oh no, not like you, I mean, and what they really mean is black and brown people or Muslims, right? And I wonder, and then I've been doing a lot of listening and research on like the Nazi movement back in the 1930s, how it all started up, the hatred for the Jews. And obviously there's been a massive new wave of anti-Semitism again, with little examples like Kanye West and all that type of stuff that went mental over in the States. And in Italy, there's a whole massive right-wing movement, which is really, really quite scary. And they're in power now. I wonder, for someone like you who does a lot of reading from wise people from the past, and you're trying to learn lessons and wisdom teachings from the past, what is it about us and I'm talking us now, why aren't we learning the lessons of the past? We've seen how, like, whether it's the Nazis or whoever it may be, have blamed a race of people for problems of the time, and it was never their fault. They were never really the scapegoats, but it was easy. Horrible stuff happened, and then we came out of it going, this can never happen again. And yet, not even 100 years down the line, I don't want to say that we're on the close to World War III again, but it doesn't feel like we're really heeding those lessons anymore. It kind of feels like we're falling back into old tropes. Oh, it's them, they're the enemy. These are the ones who are stealing our jobs. These are the ones who are making the house prices go up. It's this, but it's never, and it's like, I feel like we're kind of falling back into the errors of our forefathers. And I wonder kind of what you, as someone who does a lot of reading from past teachers, what that says to you.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I've been studying fascism and Marxism and kind of the evolution of ideology into the 19th and 20th century. The way I look at it is that the human society is like an organism. And so instead of, I think to say we're not learning the lessons of the past is kind of to assume that humans are rational, or that as a herd, as a society, as a whole, we are rational. When I think it's more like, you were hungry, yes, like you were really, really hungry, and because you were hangry, you punched someone in the face. And then today, it's like, oh, I shouldn't eat because no, I've completely hammed up that metaphor. But I think that there's a need that led to fascism in the 20th century, and that need has reemerged, and so it's got nothing to do with learning the lessons of history. I think learning the lessons of history should shape how we interact with what's going on, but I think that the re-emergence of it points to a deeper repetition of a certain trend, or there's something deeper going on that is resurfacing that might have a sort of a symmetry with what happened in the mid or the early 20th century. And so, yeah, when I look at that, there is the scapegoat thing, and there's this philosopher, René Girard, who believes that the scapegoat is how we've always dealt with crisis in society, that is increasing, and you get polarity within a culture, and that escalates until you find a scapegoat to pin it on, and now the whole culture can unify in its attack on that thing. And so, taking that Girardian kind of lens, what I see is going on is that there's a hyperfragmentation, there's a breakdown of community, there's a sense of complete dislocation. And when I look at fascism, and I look at what was good about fascism actually seemed to have been a very good solution to the crisis of nihilism and to the meaning crisis, because it unified the nation, and against a small part of the nation, as happened in Germany. In Italy, it was slightly different, and the same in Romania, but in that unification, if we just try and look, because we don't really look at what worked or why people were drawn to it, why it was a satisfactory thing. And so we're unable, I think, to appreciate what the appeal is and how we might meet it. Instead, we just go, that was horrible. Why would anyone want to repeat it? Fuck the fascists. And instead go, well, what did fascism do right? What was it speaking to that we're missing? And I think my pet theory anyway is community, is that what the Nazis and the fascists in Italy did was they mobilized the nation. Everyone had to be part of extracurricular organizations. Everything was to do with the party. Everyone had to be actively involved, from the Hitler Youth. So from when you're a kid, any adult societies that were every adult society had to be approved by the Nazi party, and you're all becoming part of the army. And so there was this entire sense that the nation was working as a whole. And much as kind of Marxists like to critique fascism and say that it was completely, essentially a bourgeois thing, that it never really went against capital, I actually think that that's wrong, because I think that fascism held the nation above capital, and capital just found a way to work within that, the military industrial complex being part of that. And so the really thing that fascism put above everything else wasn't the coin. It was some sort of this national unity, some sort of weird archetypal appeal that pulled everyone together. And we've fallen back into a society that just idealizes the coin and just fragments us down so that our sense of community ends at the four walls of our house, and we all feel isolated and we all feel disconnected. And so we're hungering for some kind of good old days, when America was great, when Europe was great, when Ireland was great, something when there was a sense of connection. You could leave your front door unlocked, and we're looking for that. And so I think that there's a hunger there. And I heard someone, Daniel Schmachtenberger, he was saying this, oxytocin, they call it the cuddle hormone. Well, it's also the genocide hormone. So your sense of feeling closer to someone, it seems, the strengthening of the in-group actually sharpens the out-group. So it turns those greys into more of a black and white. So you can feel much more connected, much more, cuddly Nazis and kill all the Jews. Those things kind of might actually go together. So the fact that we're looking for that community, that the sharper we're trying to make the in-group might really endanger the out-group. And so I think in looking for that, what I see in fascism is that maybe there's something that we're missing in terms of this complete GDP guiding everything in our fucking lives as being maybe problematic. And Marx was kind of saying the same thing, that we need this human development. We've got the capital development, we've got the technological development. Now how about letting humans play out the dialectic and become what we can be? And so I think the fascists kind of tapped into that a little bit, and I think we need to kind of look at maybe having something as our primary value system rather than simply economics, which, if you look at our politicians, they're really just fingers in the wind, and they're really just kind of working with people's pockets, and kind of the way the system is set up, we'll vote for the person who works for the best for us economically. But what happens with fascism is it kind of goes, we don't care so much for democracy, because we speak in the name of the people. And the people is different to democracy, fucking bizarrely enough. And you see this, like Trump talking about draining the swamp, and it's kind of this, the politicians are not the people. And so there's this kind of populist, and populism is different from fascism. Fascism would have had a militia wing attached to it, so there was this enforcing element. There was always this militaristic element. So the black shirts in Italy, the brown shirts in Germany, and Ireland had the blue shirts, and Romania had their own version. So there's these sort of militias that go along with them. And so there's, so obviously we're looking at something different, but I do think that it's an archetypal repetition of the pattern in 21st century populism with 20th century fascism. So I think that there's I'm trying to find the need to be met. I'm trying to find what's the good thing about fascism. What was it that actually brought people to it? Because they went, like, all of the Germans didn't just go fucking mad.
No.
Not overnight anyway. There was something that was being given. There was something happening at a psychological level that drew perfectly rational people into it. And so we have to look for those needs, and we have to try and meet those needs. And how do we do that? Because I don't actually have much faith that democracy in its current form is going to do that, because the way it's set up, we just vote for what's comfortable. And as we know with the mental health crisis, what's comfortable isn't necessarily what's good for you. And so it's kind of this oscillation of like, do we need a revolution? Do we need to reform the system?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see a way that we're not heading towards a rise in this fascistic kind of energy. Now, I do think neoliberalism is kind of what's caused this, but neoliberalism is kind of on the dip now. The globalization is kind of closing back in. Trump did it in America, brought a lot of stuff back, and Biden has only propelled that trend even further on. And you can see distancing between America and China, and some degree of distancing even between America and Europe. And so I think that there's just a breakdown, and the world is beginning to silo back in. And so that globalization trend of neoliberalism is beginning to shrink again. And with that, the sense of identity is beginning to shrink. And that's where the danger of the in-group, out-group kind of comes in. So even that anti-globalistic trend might lead us into the dangers, might play into the hands of that danger of populist fascism. So yeah, I just see that there's I think you're absolutely right. I have a friend who does boilers, and so he'd be going to all different sorts of people all across the countryside in the city. And he says this is a wave that's rising, and it's just not being spoken about because it's not polite to speak about it. And people, as you say, people aren't going to say it outside of a context in which they feel comfortable. And I think just as it becomes more ingrained, it's going to become more and more popular. It's going to become more okay to speak it. And so there's potentially a silent majority that's forming around something that we really need to speak about. But I remember with Brexit or with Trump getting elected, polls don't pick up this shit because people don't feel safe to have these conversations in public, because there's a moral police going around that's kind of saying, here, you can't fucking say shit like that. And quite often it's just hard to draw that line. But I remember after Brexit, there was an article in the Sunday Times, and they were just saying, none of us expected it. Like the day after, it was just shell shock. None of the polls pointed to this. It seemed like it was the furthest thing from possible, and it just happened. And so it was like this silent wave, this chthonic thing just bubbled up and toppled the paradigm. And that's what's slowly happening now, or not so slowly. And yeah, that I think it's a big trend that's coming, and I don't know. I can see it. I have even in something like the All In podcast. I don't know if you follow that, for Silicon Valley venture capitalists. But you can see even in these billionaires, there's one of them who, in particular, who I'm like, this is that energy, and it's not just poor, undereducated people. It's also appealing to like very powerful. You can see there's a degree of the energy in Musk. There's that kind of like radicalism of like a sort of a drain the swamp kind of energy there as well. And so I just think it's rising, and I don't really know what to do about it. And I don't really know, where the baby ends and the bathwater begins, to what extent this is going to be a repetition of history. But yeah, it's undeniable that there's an archetypal symmetry going on, that there's a day of reckoning coming, and we don't know what that's going to look like.
Do you think that that's a really great answer? I really appreciate that. Do you think that in engaging in the conversations that, for example, Jim had with that woman, I know this is almost an impossible question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think? Because when I left the pub, I just wondered, like, I wonder if that woman will, not in that moment, but maybe in a week or whatever, or the days to come after that, she will have stopped and to think about any of the, at least from my end, coherent arguments that Jim made. Do you know what I mean? And what I think was really, and I know this is probably going to cringe Jim out a little bit here and make it awkward, but what I think Jim did really, what he did really well in that conversation was he didn't make it personal. He didn't go on the attack, which would have been, at least from my point of view, really, really fucking easy to do. To go like, are you fucking stupid? Are you crazy? These are the arguments that you're making make no, like, let's just follow what you've said. It makes no logical sense whatsoever. This is all just hatred that's been stirred up. And he didn't go down that route, because obviously that route will turn someone off very quickly. And I just wonder, like, because my thing is, like you're saying about breakdown in community and stuff and conversation. And it's like, I wonder if when we have these conversations, if even then, when they're that far down the rabbit hole, when their Facebook feed is, that's all it shows them, when that they firmly believe those things, does that help, or are we just kind of pissing into the wind here?
I have a friend who has this point of view, and I will have these conversations with them, and it feels like, oh yeah, no, we're on the same page. And then the next time, it can feel like, okay, I've rationally delivered those points. We've had a good conversation around it. There's a back and forth, and we've kind of listened well to each other. But then, you go home, you tune into your Facebook feed, and all of a sudden you're re-radicalized. So I don't think. I don't know. That's another problem. That I feel like if we just destroyed social media tonight, then tomorrow I think maybe those conversations could have major impact. As it is, I don't. Yeah, I'm kind of cynical or a bit jaded, where I'm like, I don't know if I don't know that that's enough, because it's kind of like maybe they'll have a Satori moment, and maybe they'll have a moment of radical shift in their perspectives, and that is what it would take. Because I just think social media is just going to feed us the same shit again, and even if you disbelieve it, if you just keep scrolling, then it gets into you. It just invades. And so I think that there's an upstream problem from the conversations that is much trickier, and I think that that's part of the problem. And I do think we've become a lot more savvy since 2016, and I'm trying to think of who the writer was that drew the parallel. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell, drew parallels between the yellow pages at not the phone book now, but there was like these. You remember the extra like the things in the center?
Yeah.
But so those were called the yellow pages, and the printing press technology that enabled that was maybe around the 1910s. And there was a fake news crisis back then, because people were just the newspapers were just doing whatever they could to sell those papers. But then there was a transformation in the business model. People really began to distrust that mode of media, and so started to buy newspapers they could trust, and so trying to get news from sources they could trust. And Gladwell was saying, well, maybe that's what's happening now, is that we've got this new technology, the genie's out of the bottle, but it's just a matter of becoming savvy with this new technological paradigm of media consumption. And so I do think that that's happened. I do think there's been a massive reduction, or again, in my limited experience, I think there's been a reduction in polarity. But maybe that's just increased the polarity in different directions. And around the immigration thing, maybe it's moved from this more LGBT feminist kind of, maybe it's the battle lines have moved from there, where Peterson and them were fighting, over into a more immigration fascistic kind of space. And so maybe it's just a movement of polarity. But I had the sense that maybe people were becoming more wise about social media, and maybe beginning to take it with a bit more of a grain of salt. But again, I don't think we found an alternative business model like the switching to something canonical, because I think that's what they tried when all those newspapers like Guardian, New York Times put a paywall on, and instead I think that just ended up to making the problem even worse, because then the people that were actually the demographic that could afford to pay for those things ended up capturing it, and then you get a recursive loop between those things. So that ended up being problematic. So I don't know. I think we're still in the middle of figuring out this problem. I think we potentially could figure it out, but also we might just topple into a sort of a populist thing and have to learn a lesson again, but hopefully not have to see millions of people die and have a massive world war with some nuclear missiles before we learn those lessons this time. But it's always going to be different. History never plays out at the same time, but there's repetitions of energy, and we're just seeing it's a dark energy, and it's hard to know what to do with something that's that dark. Like, we thought Brexit was dark, but I mean, what's kind of coming out of the bottle now seems just infinitely worse, just like infinitely more dangerous. And so what do we do about that? I don't know, but I think some kind of media savvy, because I don't think the conversations one-on-one work as long as there's that social media context that reinforces the overall bias.
James, there's this podcast called The Emerald that I love. Don't know if you've heard of it.
Never heard of it.
No, you'll love it. He does these long form podcasts. Like, they're deep. They're not too dissimilar to your work, really. They're deep dives into particular aspects of basically myth and how we interact with the world. He has this amazing episode called "The Body is the Metaverse." And now I'm going to try and succinctly put this, but the message I took away from it was that, like you were saying, when we go on social media, it almost is otherworldly. It's not like how we used to interact with the world. And that he makes the argument that previously, when we did go into other worlds, it was in a safe space. It was around people who knew what was going on in the other world and that could help us bring the wisdom from the other world and integrate it into our lives here. And he's making the argument that when we go on social media, when we go to the metaverse, when we do these like interactive games, we are in another world that's actually not aiding us in terms of our connection with our body and our connection with the actual life on Earth here.
Or even other people, I would argue.
Or
it's
other
actually
people,
a hindrance.
absolutely. And I guess one question I want to ask you, and I think it's come lovely full circle. You mentioned at the start, you said towards the end of your 20s, I think you said that you got interested in spirituality. And I wonder what your opinion on the need for a deep-seated connection with life on Earth, with like just the essence of being here, to counteract this, because I think you're right. Like, I'm very worried about what's happening. But there are very few people that I think have a very strong connection with the natural world, with themselves, that would ever say something that woman in the pub said, and that many people are saying. Like, their needs are not being met, but they don't have, in my opinion, many of these people do not have a deep connection. That is something that is being starved from them. And I guess I wanted to ask you, even in relation to philosophy, with like Camus. You remember you said Brene Brown says that you feel shame when you feel alone, but I also felt a lot of the feelings that Camus felt were he felt alone.
And
And I wonder, like, is he alone, or was there just never someone there to facilitate an experience for him to make him feel that there was, or was there someone to help him with the integration of that?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
This is what I mean, is the lack of a wisdom tradition being like a major disparity. And I think the subculture that's trying to bring that about the most is probably the hippie subculture. But actually, I think that the spiritual hippie subculture is the one that I'm most worried about, because since COVID, that's the one I've seen most. That set of friends I've seen move toward, because you got to remember, Nazism was kind of emerging between a sort of a nationalistic version of socialism with this atavistic kind of like harking back to this ancient culture, this archetypal ground. And remember, Jung was kind of really taken on by the Nazis, but there was this really occult element to Nazism that you can't overlook. It gave it its magical glow, and they went off looking for things in the fucking hills of Tibet. Look, and their icon, their image was this ancient Indian symbol. Like the swastika was this, like, spirituality was laced throughout the Nazi movement. And part of another symmetry that I've seen in history is that since 2020 and COVID, I've seen the radicalism that is inherent to the hippie movement, which is a sort of a, hey, fuck this kind of system, we got to get back to the land. I've seen that turn into a mistrust of science and society, and a sort of emerging into, Russell Brand is the fucking archetypal case of this, whereas the hippie subculture has merged into that far right culture and is bringing these magical dimensions of this mythical race that we are, this historical archetypal infusion of magic that gives the right wing thing so much more gravitas, and so much more this sense of the immigrants are polluting something that's beautiful, this like ancient Irish or whatever, the fucking American dream. Wherever you are, you can just localize that. It's that hippie element that gives it the magic, that gives it more of an archetypal halo. And since 2020, I've just seen that emerge, and being in plant medicine kind of circles and meditation circles, I'm just like, oh shit, you people are supposed to say we're fucked, because you're making the problem worse. Because it's just this kind of a self-actualized thing that's focused on a magical element, and I'm just like, this is a slippery slope over there into the right wing thing. I think we desperately need a wisdom tradition.
Yeah.
But this sort of a shamanistic side of things, actually, I have no faith in it. I've only seen that it's making things more dangerous.
Yeah.
So while I agree with you about Camus, and the idea for a wisdom tradition, I don't know what we do about that, because, and this is where something as boring as Christianity, something as boring as an old-fashioned traditional religion, where it's just full of dogma and bullshit that had no magic in it, but like, it had the magic if you delve deep enough. I'm like, maybe we need something really boring. Maybe we need something we just need something to numb us back to a medieval sleep, because this excitement of a friend of mine calls them the power plants, the plant medicine, where these people are just getting fucking jacked up and shit that's way out of their control by people who might have done 5 sessions of ayahuasca themselves, and you're just like, hey, let's use the power of the gods because there's a lot of money in it. And again, it comes back to that profit motive being a very dangerous thing when we bring them into it. It kind of, I do think it corrupts everything. And maybe I'm reading too much Marx, and it's kind of like shaping my thought in a certain way, but there's something that it warps. There was this great a guy wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review. He says, you are what you measure. And he was a lecturer in MIT, and he was saying they came up with this measure for how good a lecturer was. And it was all this complex algorithm of all these different activities. And he says, I knew it wasn't making me a better lecturer, but I wanted to do well. So I just like optimizing myself for this. And I think when it comes to money, when it comes to followers, likes, subscribes, when it comes to GDP, these are the measures we optimize for. And I think because those are the measures, and I know someone tried the happiness development index or something like that. I think it was Burma or someone in the Far East. But because these are our measures, as long as those are the primary measures, we're fucked. And the only thing offering an alternative is the far left and the far right. They're the only ones saying, hey, maybe we should have something else to measure ourselves by than these metrics. And the trouble is that the metrics that they're offering are, purity, normally leading purity spirals of like our race or how good you are with everyone. Like there's a woke version of that and there's a fascist version of that. And purity spirals tend to lead to the sort of oxytocin genocidal dynamics. So, and I mean that in a metaphorical sense. I don't think the woke would ever lead to anything genocidal, but I just mean the sense of the outgripping, the shaming, the increasing polarization in society. So, this is kind of where Girard got to. It's just like, hey, maybe we need a scapegoat, but we can't afford a scapegoat now because we've got nuclear missiles and the weapons are too good. So what do we do? Like, how do we get out of the current crisis? And Girard's solution was Catholicism. I'm not so convinced because that's always seemed like I'm not going to say a crock of shit to me, but a crock of shit to me. Yeah. There's something there, but it's not. Yeah.
I'm glad that you spoke about that, because I often felt like, probably very similar to you, that when I'm in these fields and the fields that are apparently facilitating deeper compassion within yourself and for others, that doesn't seem to be happening for a lot of the people. And what makes me think is that how powerful are these other worlds, i.e. like the algorithms and the Facebooks and the Instagrams, TikToks, if you can actually have an experience that you would describe as divine, as like incredibly connective, and then days later, weeks later, you're going back and going, listen, it would just be better if there's too many Mohammeds here, or there's something. And it makes me think that, wow, like we really are in this position of either one, the other worlds are so powerful that they're able to minimize or dilute the experience, a real powerful experience of humans, or two, that we don't have a critical edge. And I know for myself, like I did a bachelor's where we did a lot of like theoretical work, like a lot of colonial studies, a lot of feminist studies. And I know that like the tools that I picked up there have helped me so much to navigate the quote unquote alternative spiritual hippie world, because otherwise it gets too simplistic. And it's almost like you were saying about Stoicism. It's like once it's in the mainstream, you're going to be cutting off corners that are more complex and take months and years to kind of work your way around. And all of a sudden you get the stupid stuff like, let me manifest the best life for me, and it doesn't really matter what John down the road says or cares about, and that kind of thing. And I don't like, I'm really on board with what you're saying. Like, I think the answer is to come back to some sort of wisdom tradition. And I heard someone write the other day that maybe we could find almost like a druidry, like an old sense of connection to something mystical with the deep acceptance and knowledge that we have of like what we believe humans to be now, and more of like a critical edge, because I'm sure you've seen there's more and more people that are just kind of succumbing to, like, not I don't want to say succumbing to, just taking the decision to say, yeah, maybe Buddhism is just my path and Christianity is my path.
Yeah.
But we don't need to discuss the potential problematic nature of making those decisions, you know.
Yeah, and because it gets complicated. Of like, there's something, you don't want to become a dilettante who just takes what they want from any tradition. But on the other hand, if you devote your entire life to Buddhism as a person that grew up in Irish Catholic, 21st century, there's something fucking weird about that as well. And so, where do you go between the two of those? Where do you go between? And it's like, I do think there's something in metamodernism or integral thought of like this idea of spiral dynamics and people being at different levels of a developmental pattern, and culture being in this new developmental pattern, the metamodern version after the postmodern, after the modern, after the traditional. That maybe there's something in that, and it at least gives us a language that's been very influential for me, of being able to see, oh, maybe you're just seeing the world through a different lens and appreciating, okay, this kind of comes out of that, and being able to relate different, like seeing how postmodernists and hippies can be in the same cultural meme, whereas Arnold Schwarzenegger and Einstein are in a different one. You know what I mean? Like being able to appreciate maybe that there's these other developmental patterns that are at work, and maybe that gives us a way of being like, well, yeah, okay, like what level of the truth are you at in terms of what you're dealing with? But then the trouble with the development hierarchy like that is that everyone wants to be at the top. And so it's just like, hey, I'm fucking level yellow. What are you? What Power Ranger are you today? And so you just end up with a dick measuring contest in terms of that. So yeah, you end up with your own problems. So it's, yeah. I mean, this is my journey. I'm just like, what the fuck do you do? What the fuck is going on? Like where do we go from here? Because all I see is just, I keep looking at these different things and being like, that kind of unravels once you look at it, and that unravels once you look at it, and it's not clear. You can't really run a scientific experiment on something this large, because it's just, you're watching trends play out, and so you're trying to figure out what's going on. But my God, it's an interesting thing to study. It's also a terrifying thing to study when it comes to like the potential precipices we're coming to. But it's yeah, as you've seen, everything I touch unravels when I look too closely at it. But I feel like you're quite similar in a way, or maybe I'm just projecting that. But I felt like you were quite kindred souls in the being confused about what to do.
Yeah,
like recognizing that there's something going on, but not being sure what to do about it.
Yeah, has to be the first step, right? Maybe even the second step.
Hopefully, even the third.
Yeah.
If it's the third, we're in business. We're already 3 steps of the way there.
Third,
you know?
we can make money off it.
Sell it to the chumps and then build our own bunker so we can survive the fascist takeover, and maybe even capitalize. You know, who knows?
Let's get paid to stop making people feel so certain. That would be really rewarding.
Yeah, that's a good job. Not so lucrative, like as Peterson will show you. It's much more lucrative to be certain, but you know, if you can make a living being uncertain, that's good as well.
Yeah. James, it's been fantastic. I wanted to end it maybe with a kind of practical usage of philosophy, maybe that helps you on a daily or weekly basis, that maybe a listener might kind of listen. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm still going to try process this conversation, but is there something that like would kind of just aid that once I go into my next week or my next few months? Is there a kind of thing that really helps you with?
So I actually think it's a very simple thing. I've tried a lot of meditation. I've tried a lot of different things. A consistent philosophy I've had in my personal life is a philosophy of the next step, of like the future being such an especially with the path I've kind of taken in life, being such a confusing and labyrinthine kind of thing, that I go, okay, I don't see how this could possibly work out. But I can see what the next step is where I might find out, you know what I mean? So I'll like the thing, that chasm, that uncrossable chasm as a teenager, I couldn't see how to get across, but actually I just started reading books, and one book led to another book, and out of that, oh, hey, here comes Camus, here comes philosophy, and all of a sudden a million steps lit up in a sort of a Billie Jean kind of, the image of Michael Jackson and Billie Jean just came to mind, of like walking on these steps and it all lit up. And so
Might be
I
the first
think,
time Billie Jean is mentioned in the context of philosophy.
and you know what, I'm proud to be the one to do it.
And Michael Jackson, I think.
Well, Michael Jackson probably comes up in very different contexts than the context of philosophy. But so I believe in the next step. I also believe that maybe the next step isn't the most obvious thing. And so I think, I've been studying this guy recently, and he talks about the default mode network. Basically, when you're doing nothing, your brain, this so-called default mode network, which is a load of different centers in the brain, medial prefrontal cortex and angular gyrus and a few other things, light up. And if you're doing an activity, that part of your brain shuts down, unless the activity is self-oriented, is it journaling, is it thinking about your own life, then that comes back online. So there's a level of self-reflection that just happens when you're doing nothing. You'll notice it when you're going to bed at night if you listen to nothing but your own thoughts. So my thing would just be orient yourself with this idea of what's the next step, and just make a cup of tea and sit down and look at nature for a while. Like, just stare out your window for 20 minutes and don't meditate. It's not meditation. It's because meditation, you're doing something because you're focused on breath, you're focused on something else, so you're coming out of the default mode network. Just be in that thing, and something will happen. You'll be like, oh, I got to do that thing, and then you go do that thing, and that's the next step, and it'll just happen. I struggle to sit still for 20 minutes where I'm like, oh, I meant to change that thing, oh, I meant to wash that thing, oh, I better do that, oh, geez, this window is filthy, I better go out there and mop. You know what I mean? It's like I'll get distracted because the discomfort of sitting in that, but just the activity of sitting in that, I think, is enough to get you to take that next step. And you do that regularly enough, these next steps will emerge, and the Billie Jean path to glory will be there. You know? Who doesn't love Billie Jean?
That sounds like that could be our marketing tool for our business as well. We could have like the Billie Jean steps.
Yeah.
People could just let me get on those steps. we could buy a studio and build those steps.
Yeah, and then you'll find you get sued by Michael Jackson's estate for using Billie Jean.
Probably get a letter in the morning. Yeah, we were only joking, I swear.
Well, I thought he was free because he got Michael Jackson. I thought he was a paedophile, so it was okay for us to use his music. It was ironic, you see. I'd also just like to apologize to anyone in the Michael Jackson estate. I know he was found innocent. It was a joke. You know, Billie Jean's great.
Bit of lighthearted nature towards the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, James, essentially do a bit of nothing. Do nothing more.
And even more nothing than meditation. Like really, like literally nothing. Just sit there and just, your mind does it. Your mind will put you in a stew of discomfort where you'll have to do something. So just sit in that and let the next step emerge. That would be my take.
James, thanks so much.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this.
Thanks a million.
Yeah, it was great. And now Seb has another Irish friend.
Hey!
slowly but surely, and hopefully, as long as that lady in the pub isn't on the board, hopefully I'll be granted my Irish citizenship soon.
Well, she's probably giving you another clue on how to become
exactly
integrated.
that. Yeah,
just start bashing on immigrants and foreigners.
100%.
And probably be like, yeah, you're one of them. I really feel connected to you.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Guys, we'll leave the links to James' podcast and his YouTube channel in the show notes. I think we'll probably release this in 2 parts. I think probably is probably the best idea
more
here.
Digestible, yeah.
Yeah, more digestible, and leave people wanting a bit more, you know. We'll release them soon. James, just thank you a million for your time. It's been really, really, really enjoyable.
An absolute pleasure.